Now there's a recording started. Oh yeah, I see the sign now. Thank you. Okay, I think we'll get started. Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the monthly webinar series hosted by the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, also known as the CASC, which is based at the University of Colorado Boulder. I'm Imtiaz Rangwala, climate science lead at CASC. I'm co-hosting this webinar with Heather Yoakum, who is our stakeholder engagement lead. We bring you these monthly webinars to facilitate a discussion of science, research, and best practices related to adaptation and resource management under a rapidly changing climate, with a focus on the North Central US that encompasses the Missouri and the Upper Colorado River basins. Before I introduce our speakers for today, a quick word on housekeeping. We are recording this webinar, and you can find all our webinar recordings from the past on our website. During the webinar, all participants will be muted, but you'll have the ability to unmute during the Q&A period at the end. We, however, greatly encourage you to submit your questions and comments through the chat box anytime during the webinar, and we'll bring them out at the end. And now I'm very pleased to introduce our speakers for today. Our first speaker will be Dr. Owen McKenna. Owen is a research ecologist at Northern Prairie Wildlife Research Center in Jamestown, North Dakota. He did his PhD in environmental life sciences at the Arizona State University. His research is focused on studying how changes in climate and land use can alter the hydrology and geochemistry of prairie pothole wetlands. Owen has explored a regional climate-induced eco-hydrological state shift in wetland ecosystem through an analysis of long-term data. He has also been involved in the development and application of the Pothole Hydrology Linked System Simulator, also known as the PHYLLIS model, which is an integrated hydrogeochemical model for prairie pothole wetlands. Owen is currently using PHYLLIS to assist large land managers in estimating the future impacts of climate and land use change in critical migratory waterfowl habitat. Our second speaker is Ned Wright. Ned is a wildlife biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Habitat and Population Evaluation Team, also known as the HAPET, which is based in Bismarck, North Dakota. Ned did his bachelor's in conservation biology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He oversees the coordination of long-term survey of waterfowl populations in the Prairie Pothole region. The survey is recognized as the primary method to monitor the abundance and distribution of breeding-waterfowl by the Prairie Pothole joint venture. Again, I welcome both these speakers, and I'll ask Owen to please take it away.
Great, thanks, Imtiaz. Thanks for the introduction to come talk, and thanks to Ned for joining in on this in this adventure. And today we want to bring you some different aspects of research going on in the Prairie Pothole region that's been funded by the North Central CASC, and hopefully give you a better story of some of the different modeling tools and products we're trying to integrate in trying to understand what the future holds for the Prairie Pothole region in terms of changes in climate. So for some folks that are on this call that might not be familiar with our region that we're talking about, since the NCCASC does have quite a large footprint. So the Prairie Pothole region is this center of the continent area that stretches out into Canada, all the way down to Iowa, and is about 800,000 square kilometers, which if you stack it up is similar to the whole west coast of the US with Washington, Oregon, and California. So pretty big area, and one of the properties of this region is all these glacially formed depressions that make up these really unique ecosystems called prairie pothole wetlands that support breeding waterfowl, migratory waterfowl, and other water birds. And some estimates are 50 to 80% of North America's ducks breed in the Prairie Pothole region. And this region is also known for the highly variable interannual and decadal climate patterns. And so when I first got here in 2016, we were sort of trying to summarize some of this a recent phenomenon that wasn't so recent by the time I got here, of this extreme wet period since 1993. So we focused mostly on North Dakota as sort of the center of the Prairie Pothole region, and to try to summarize not only this climate shift, but what some of the ecosystem responses to this climate shift has been. And so looking at our monthly drought index, so which tells us sort of how wet the system is, in the 50s all the way through the late 80s, you can see we had these sort of pretty tight oscillation of wet to dry, bouncing back and forth, and then a 4-year drought period from the late 80s into the early 90s. In the 1983, we shifted to this continued wet period where the wet months are wetter than before, and then the drier months are much wetter than what a drought used to look like. And so we had this really big increase in the Palmer Drought Index from month to month. And then with that, it was only about a 12% increase in mean annual precipitation. So you have this increase in soil moisture, antecedent water on the landscape. And then with that, these increases in precipitation were mostly coming from May, June, July, and October. So larger precipitation events on top of a wetter landscape is no surprise. Good for the wetlands in terms of delivering water to those wetland ecosystems that are dependent on rainfall inputs and runoff as well. And so at the local scale on the left here, the Cottonwood Lake Study Area is a place that Northern Prairie has been studying for many decades. And you can see what I was talking about before, the late 70s into that late 80s drought, are semi-permanent wetlands in gray, which are the larger wetlands, smaller wetlands in black. You can see how these wetlands have responded to that shift since 1993, where the larger wetlands have kind of continued in this more lake-like state or more permanent water bodies. And then zooming out to the region, when we look at some of the survey work from Fish and Wildlife Service, not only at the local scale, but on the regional scale, we see a similar pattern where ponded wetland basins in the month of May, which is crucial for breeding waterfowl, have responded similarly post 93. And so that's sort of been this interesting shift that we've observed. And looking into the future, what we also can say is that the many different models and emission scenarios are all in agreement that it's going to get hotter throughout the Prairie Pothole region. So from the northwest in Ranfurly to the southeast down in Webster City, Iowa. It just depends on which model you look at for how much hotter. Precipitation is a different story. So if we look at similarly, going from the northwest to the southeast, we look at all those different models, comparing to the last 30 years that we just experienced to the future, so the end of the 21st century, these models are showing potentially decreases or increases in precipitation change. And so one of the major things from a study, NC CASC funded study from 2019, is that we wanted to look at how could we assist in understanding these responses in the May ponds under all these different climate change models. And so we used that pothole hydrology link systems simulator, the system model at local areas throughout the Prairie Pothole region, and looked at relationships of how those individual basins change under different climate, and related that to the density of May ponds in the region to try to get this understanding of how May ponds might shift in the future. And so we have a paper coming out in Ecological Applications where we show that it looks like, based off of the way we set things up and all those different climate futures, a lot of the models are trending towards drier, but the distribution in the future of where the May ponds are going to be located, barring any more land use change, will be, will not shift that much. So we could have between a 1% increase to 12% decrease in May ponds on average. But again, that distribution where the highest density of May ponds is looking like it's gonna stay that way. And so I'll switch over to Ned, who's going to kind of talk about, we have this understanding of the climate and wetland hydrology responses, and how do we link that to our waterfowl responses.
Thanks, Owen. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Good. Okay, well, so yeah, I mean, what we're looking at from a prairie pothole waterfowl perspective is that we understand some basic concepts, and a lot of it as far as waterfowl is tied to wetness, obviously. So we can track wetness over the landscape for a long time. And if you want to bump to the next one, back in the 80s at Northern Prairie, actually, they developed these, strong understanding, these what we call the Arrowwood regressions, that are essentially just the equations that we can use to understand the link between wetness and waterfowl settling patterns. And so if you look at these over time, what happens is that you get variation within the shape of these curves, and not so much the shape, but the magnitude of these curves. But you kind of settle to one basic concept, and that's kind of the last piece here, is that ducks like water. And so over time, if we can utilize what Owen's doing to understand a little bit more how ducks are going to shift around the landscape as water changes, that's useful for us. So I'm going to bump to the next one. So I coordinate what's called the 4 square mile survey, and it's got two basic premises that it's working with, or two portions of it. And all this was based out of work that was done back in the mid 80s at Northern Prairie by Lou Corden and a bunch of other folks back then. And what we do is we, across the entire 5-state area of the US portion of the PPR, we're collecting aerial photography at a whole bunch of different plots, and we're tracking the changes in wetness over time. And then at the same time, on the same plots, we're sending out field surveyors from all of our different wetland management districts to collect right around 5,000 observations of ducks on those same or many of those wetlands twice a year. And so essentially we've got two inputs to the black box modeling, which is pond wetness and the pair counts. And then what we get out of it is pair estimates and recruitment estimates. While it wasn't the original intent of the survey, we also have since, and this is also in conjunction with Northern Prairie, developed these models of pair wetland relationships so that we can understand a little bit better across the landscape and across time how ducks are responding to water. So next one. This is just some kind of basic background on 4 square mile survey. We create breeding pair estimates for 13 species. The main thing that's happening here is we're using those regression equations that we showed you, the Arrowwood regression, which would show, according to the wetness that we observe from the aerial photography, how many pairs we would expect to observe on a wetland. And then we compare that to what was observed actually by the folks in the field, and we come up with a correction factor that's applied to those regression models on a district by district level. So there's 25 districts and 13 species. So there's a lot of different gamma values that are applied to those regression equations. And then we essentially expand those numbers up to the entire universe and estimate populations for wetland management districts and ultimately states in the PPR. The next one. And then we also do have these recruitment estimates that we're working with as well. And I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but just be it known that associated with those pair estimates, we're also trying to understand what the response for ducklings is for the different water. So if you go to the next one. So this is the distribution of the plots. There's 710 plots across 5 states. And over the last almost 40 years now, or not quite 40 years, but getting there, we've obviously mapped millions of acres of wetland. On each of those 700 plots, we map every single wetland on an annual basis. And so this actually gives us a pretty interesting piece of data that we can help Owen and their folks kind of calibrate their model and understand how Phyllis is performing, and then ultimately then feed Phyllis back into what we're doing and try to understand how that impacts waterfowl populations. You know, the upside to looking at this map as you look across all those things is that we've got a lot of data. And kind of the downside is that we've got a lot of data. So one of our challenges is just understanding how to utilize this data to its fullest potential and have it available for us and partners to use. And so that's a big project that we're constantly working on. It is recognized, as Imtiaz said before, that as the primary method of monitoring abundance and distribution of waterfowl by the Prairie Pothole joint venture. Go to the next one. And like I mentioned, these models of pair wetland relationships. There's lots of steps to get from where we were talking before, but this is just to show off the fact that the input data from the 4 square mile survey ultimately becomes the for our conservation targeting, what we call the upland, we call it the thunderstorm map generally speaking, but it's an upland accessibility. So it's trying to understand how many pairs of waterfowl have access to a given upland management unit so that we can understand where we want to put our efforts as far as conservation, delivery, and targeting. And there's a lot here, and if people are interested later on, we can go into some more detail, but I just wanted to kind of point that out. And so I think I'm going to kick back to you on now, right?
Yeah. Thanks, Ned. Yeah, so basically moving from that first study that we did where we were trying to relate some of our model outputs, integrate future climate models, and then zoom out to the landscape and put things in the metric of May ponds that Fish and Wildlife Service use. We ultimately, and then after that was, thinking about the 4 square mile survey and how we have, these wetland data, we have these aerial delineations of wetlands for multiple years. And what if we knew the bathymetry of some of those wetlands and we could run our model on those and then try to then plug in our model outputs, our Phyllis model outputs directly to some of these models for estimating breeding pairs and get more into, from the hydrology more to some of the biotic responses. And so Ned and I did a little exercise in GIS and saw that with the help of Brian Tangen, we identified a large data set from the Gleason and Tangen surveys of where we have wetlands that we have known bathymetry for, and which one of those actually overlapped with 4 square mile survey wetlands. And nice enough for our study design, each of the states in the US PPR was represented in that overlap. So 25 wetlands, 23 of the 25 are NWI wetlands. And then we're working with Ned and his team to really try to understand, which ones have the best data through time. And so in total on this team, we've got a few other co-investigators, Dave Mache from Northern Prairie, Chuck Lesh from HAPET, and then Imtiaz is our climate, making sure that we're using all the latest and greatest in all the climate data and making sure we're using it correctly. And then our modeling team at Northern Prairie and at HAPET, so Karen Ross and Lissy McCullough, and then also the HAPET GIS folks are helping to, with our kind of data quality checks. And then Brian Tangen, like I said, is helping us to unearth some of these old bathymetry data sets and get them usable for our purposes. And so our objectives for this is to run our system, our model, mechanistic model of wetland water levels for those study wetlands, and then validate that with the areas that have been delineated year by year by the 4 square mile survey, and then again try to plug that into some of the breeding waterfowl models, and then assess with our running our model with future climate, assess what's the range of potential futures for how those wetlands might respond to climate change. And we also kind of had this extra objective once we started to get the ball rolling, because this was really a great exercise of working with 4 square mile survey data and having this application where we could tap into that big data set, but also I think it's helping Ned to understand, if other people are going to be using the data set, what types of questions and what types of sort of fun in the weeds data concerns are there. But then we also have all these different inputs for our model in terms of bathymetry, and we lucked out by having wetland bathymetry, area to volume relationships and catchment sizes that have already been surveyed, but it's a pretty intensive process. So we wanted to know if we could use some averages, some known averages by ecoregion, and what the differences would be. And so, we parameterize our model from these different inputs, and then compare to the 4 square mile survey areas, and then we're kind of stuck on this model validation stage right now before we look at the future, because we thought, oh, this could be an interesting methods paper for to help out folks to see, oh, could we use sort of known information to forecast this. And yeah, as I was saying, the bathymetry data set that we're using, we're using a subset of these wetlands that overlap with 4 square mile survey points from Iowa, Minnesota, South Dakota, North Dakota, and Montana. And then from this survey, there's also these ecoregion specific or averages for bathymetry, but also averages for wetland areas and catchment areas as well. And then in terms of our climate inputs to run the model, we are using GridMet, and we did a comparison of GridMet compared to PRISM, as well as the NOAA weather stations, just to double check that GridMet is going to be performing for us well, and which is great because MTS again is teaching us more and more about those advances in those data products, and how now by using GridMet we can use future climate data from the MACA downscale projections and not have to deal with doing the delta method of kind of changes, looking at changes. It's all embedded within there. So looking at these 32 global circulation models and 2 emission scenarios, and then similar to the earlier study that I was explaining. And so this is kind of where we're at now, is getting these wetlands ready to forecast in the future. And so I'll just run through some of these sort of side products, and then also ways that we're looking to develop data visualization tools to help along the way. And so as I was explaining before, we thought it was interesting that, if we run the Phyllis model for estimating wetland areas under given precipitation and temperature inputs, and then we compare to this black line, which is the 4 square mile survey areas, and this is for one wetland in Minnesota. So if we use different bathymetric inputs from different sources, either derived from LiDAR tools or from those ecoregion specific averages, or knowing the bathymetry studies from on the ground, what are the differences compared to those aerially derived wetland areas from year to year. And this is what we're assessing right now, and trying to say, could we use products that are available from remotely sensed tools to do our wetland modeling without actually going and doing the bathymetry studies. And so far, yeah, you can see the spread. This is just one of the 25 wetlands, but yeah, you can see there's some variability, and some years perform better than others, and that's what we're really diving into right now. But what I wanted to do as we were, running the models and as we were developing this, is to have a data visualization dashboard to go along with it, with the hope of when we have the results to show, that we have this kind of interactive tool for folks to actually play around with the data and look at these differences throughout the Prairie Pothole region. And so that's what our team is developing this alongside, so that we can plug in the final results for the specific wetlands that we were looking at, in terms of what the average hydrology has been and what the future hydrology may look like under different climate futures. And we're also doing this at a local scale for a project funded by the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, where we're focused more on Minnesota and Iowa. And this is kind of where we're trying to develop these dashboards, these interactive dashboards. And this is only for a couple wetland complexes that Fish and Wildlife Service has monitoring data for. So again, we parameterize our hydrology model, we check it against their monitoring data, and then forecast in the future using those different climate scenarios, and trying to understand with this sort of co-production model, working with the managers and the management agencies to try to determine what's the best information for them to use. And so that's what we're sort of building these dashboards in our Shiny, and then working out what those response variables for managers are going to be. So I will flip it back to Ned, and he can kind of give some closing remarks of what his take on the importance of this collaboration has been, and where he sees things going.
Thanks, Owen. So, I mean, the real question, I think, and everybody wants to get at is how can we do the appropriate planning into the future if things are if we're gonna see different scenarios. What are we doing now that we need to be doing different in order to be in the right place at the right time in the future? And so, from a HAPET standpoint and a Fish and Wildlife standpoint, and I believe, public benefit standpoint, one of the ways that we're hoping to be able to integrate this in particular is with the prioritization of delivery from duck stamp sales. So, the Fish and Wildlife Service purchases a lot of easement, and a fair amount of money comes into the Prairie Pothole region from the duck stamps sales, which is just every time somebody wants to head to the wetlands to hunt ducks in the fall, they need to purchase a duck stamp. Some people purchase more, or purchase them just for the aesthetic sense of it, or as a conservation tool just to put some money into it. But a fairly large pot of money builds up each year, and currently, at least for the last 10 years and hoping into the future, about 70% of that has been coming to the Prairie Pothole region to purchase easements primarily. And so if we could have some climate models that would help us understand the ways in which we're seeing a different scenario in the future, then ideally we would be able to introduce those, either the variation that we would see into the future, or any certain scenario that we felt fairly confident about, that we could use those models to help us understand how to spend that money more efficiently. And so that's coming from our grassland easements, wetland easements, and fee title acquisition. And so, I mean, that's one big application of what we could do with this into the future, if we're able to, really understand what the future has to hold for the Prairie Pothole region. And then that would be once the climate models have been worked out, then hopefully we could be in a position to apply those to our waterfowl models and continue improving our waterfowl models at concurrently, so that we could do the best we could into the future. I think that's pretty much what I got from my standpoint.
Yeah, so I would echo that and say that that's something that we're trying to kind of ask, is that, we're developing this tool of Phyllis, and sort of what's the best utility for a high parameter local mechanistic model. How do we fuse information outputs from that into some of these larger scale spatial planning type exercises, and we're always trying to figure out how we can better do that at different scales for different purposes with different management agencies. So with that, I'll just say thanks for watching, and it looks like we've got plenty of time for questions. And yeah, thanks again to the NC CASC for the invitation, and yeah, hope we can have a nice little discussion here.
Well, thank you very much, Owen and Ned, and thank you for leaving so much time for the questions. Folks should be able to unmute themselves and also share their video if they want, as they participate in this Q&A at this point. I can probably start with one of the questions we've gotten on our chat box, and from Dennis Longknife. And Dennis, feel free to unmute yourself and ask that question as well, but I can just maybe start on what you've asked here. So Dennis Longknife, I was a former wetland specialist and current climate coordinator for the Fort Belknap Indian community in north central Montana. So his question is really about the size of prairie potholes. Is there a correlation between relict, buffalo, wallows, and small prairie potholes? Are they designated under same delineation or modeling schemes? And his comment is that our prairie pothole region here on the reservation are very small, 30 to 50 yards in diameter, and a few larger ones that are some similar to North Dakota's. So again, any thoughts there?
Thank you for reading my questions.
And feel free to add to that, please, Dennis.
Oh no, it sounds kind of confusing, but we got a lot of buffalo sign on our prairie landscape through our region here in north central Montana, and I was just wondering if they could be classified as wetland sites, or they probably wouldn't have the function values. That's one of the questions I was wondering. I was maybe trying to go after some funding to find that out, what the differences are. Do you have any anything to add?
I don't have a ton to add, but I will just jump in and say that generally speaking, when it comes to what we're delineating as wetlands and regimes in particular, we're coming at it from a baseline data of NWI data, so National Wetlands Inventory. And so there, if there were national, NWI wetlands that my guess, I'm just spitballing here, but I'm guessing that the buffalo were probably attracted to the areas that were moist and that kind of stuff. And so I'm pretty sure that there's probably a fairly good chance that there's some overlap between, where wetlands eventually got mapped and what was those relic wallows would be my guess, but I don't know exactly where I'd take it from there.
Yeah, and similarly, I think there are more standardized classification schemes for related to hydric soils and wetland plant indicator species that could be done to try to identify if these areas function as wetlands, and also having an aerial image record to try to sleuth back and see if these areas are holding water. Ponded water through certain times would also help with that. But yeah, sure. I think overall, if there are depressions that can hold water, we certainly could use LiDAR data and map out how big they are and how big the drainage area is into them, and try to get an estimate of how frequently they do pond water.
And I'll just really quickly jump into and just say that you mentioned that they're pretty small, 30 to 50 yards in diameter. And, you know, without going back to the slide, you saw that the original Arrowwood regressions were this curvilinear relationship in which the at lower, you know, the number of individuals likely to use as far as waterfowl, smaller wetlands, you know, per unit area is highest at the beginning of the curve. So the smaller wetlands have a way higher per wet acre utilization than some of the larger wetlands do. So, you know, just because they're small doesn't mean they're not important. And that's certainly been like kind of the focus of what Fish and Wildlife has been doing with the small wetlands easement acquisition, is that a lot of people see the smallest wetlands as, oh, that's just kind of like a wallow, it's a mud pit, that's what we can get rid of. But you know, honestly speaking, a huge portion of the population of waterfowl that are breeding are using those really small wetlands in the Dakotas and the prairie potholes as their settling wetlands. So they're all important.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, our prairie potholes here are got clay loam soils, so it looks deceiving because they look like they're full of water, but you could walk out there and walk on top, like it looks like you're walking on top of the water, but permeability isn't there, so that the water just sits there. But we're going through a drought right now, so the area is in severe drought status, and all our prairie potholes are dried up. You know, waterfowl are gone, of course. Probably went north or more towards North Dakota. So, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Again, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions. Again, if you're asking questions, we cannot hear you. Maybe you're muted. Well, maybe I'll start with a question on my end. And just more on the climate side of things. So I saw 93 when, you know, you shifted to kind of a wetter regime. It was really interesting to see that year down here in Colorado and also much of the Southwest. From the temperature perspective, we shifted into a warmer regime in 94. So, you know, very few years were below normal temperature-wise. So that 94 was a real shift. And so it's interesting to kind of see maybe a continental scale shift in climate occurred. It's also interesting to see, you know, that a lot of precip came in months like the late spring, early summer, and midsummer. So June, July, you saw a lot of precip. You know, many models suggest that, you know, actually the precip will increase much of the year, but actually decrease in kind of the primary summer months. And so which is kind of, you haven't seen, at least in the recent times. My question was more related to, are you seeing more fluctuations? That one of the things suggested by, you know, that we hear, at least in the climate change context, and for the northern plains is, hey, we may increase the variability. So both the dry and wet aspects of those variabilities. And so despite the fact that, hey, it's been getting wetter, have you also seen like large fluctuations?
Well, yeah, currently, you know, if people were just zooming or just coming in right now, you would see a big drought throughout North Dakota, seasonally speaking, and I think what we're seeing too is sort of an increase in the heterogeneity in these systems, and that comes with the territory of more increases in precipitation coming in these higher energy storm months as well. And you know, that's, you know, as you saw from the PHDI chart, you know, we came into this wet period from a 4-year historical drought period, so late 80s, early 90s. You know, if you just track PHDI, which is sort of you know, this proxy of soil moisture on the landscape, it's been so much wetter since then. But certainly, if you zoom into certain specific years and you just look at how much, you know, you look at the water balance for year to year, there's been still a lot of variability. We just seem overall to be kind of buffered by this large reservoir of soil moisture and these really, really large months of high PHDI.
So is that kind of separate and not necessarily related to the question directly too? I think, I think I can feel Neil Nemeth, who I think is on the phone right now, telling me to not forget to mention that one of the things that we're seeing and is really a concern to us is actually the secondary effects of climate change. So, you're talking about things getting wetter, and at one point we're talking about all this variation and drying and getting, but now all of a sudden we're getting into this wetter period, and what that has done is it's allowed for kind of a really rapid shift in land use change here. So when 15, 20 years ago, the Dakotas were dominated by, winter wheat and things like that. Now you're seeing tons and tons of soybeans and corn on the landscape, because between, genetically modified crops, and also at the same time, we're getting wetter and we're staying wetter. And so we're not seeing the droughts that would make it difficult to make a go at the agricultural conversion. Now we've got a big problem. And so it's not, it's not only it got wetter, it's good for ducks. It gets wetter, it also gets good for agriculture, and good for agriculture can mean a shift away from traditional ranching landscapes, which are good for waterfowl production, into an agricultural landscape, which is not as good.
Yeah, you remind me of that maybe there are no winners in climate change. So if you are a winner related to others will come and join you.
Yeah, and I think the variability within, we talk about the Prairie Pothole region as this one area, right? But we have this climate gradient, temperature and precip gradient going from Iowa up into Canada, and temperature gradient as well. So there's a lot of variability in terms of climate, but then also just in terms of the sort of geological template of where we sit. So, naturally there's areas where you have a lot higher density of wetland basins. And, it could be even here in where I sit in Jamestown, it looks a lot different than where Ned sits in Bismarck. And you have these features like the Missouri Coteau that, from that thunderstorm map, you can kind of see the Missouri Coteau moving through the Dakotas as this high density area of wetlands and grasslands. And there, if agriculture continues to expand and you want to see drainage, there's not much places for the water to go because everything's so closed. But then you move down into the Drift Prairie, the Red River Basin watershed, things are a little bit more similar in terms of the geomorphology as Iowa and parts of Southwest Minnesota that have experienced the highest rates of wetland drainage through time. But then also, we get to see that the response of the wetlands to drainage pressure, historical drainage pressure, you really see it during the really wet times. So especially consolidation drainage, where smaller wetlands get picked off, drained into larger wetlands. You don't really see the responses of the larger wetlands until it gets really wet, and now the effective drainage area of that larger wetland is so much bigger, and you have these downstream water quality type implications that can arise as well. So yeah, now we're seeing these climate and land use change interactions. And in Iowa, obviously, there's been a lot richer history of row crop agriculture than in places in the Dakotas. So to me, it's a really interesting place to study these big changes.
Hey, Owen, Ned. Hi, this is Josh Vest with the Prairie Pothole Joint Venture.
Hey, Josh.
Hey, great presentation. Thanks so much for sharing this information today. Yeah, I think this is something that obviously I think the Prairie Pothole Joint Venture Technical Committee is going to be quite interested to track and have some discussions around as we think about our future planning horizons here for the partnership. obviously a key piece of that. And thanks, Ned, for echoing those points about those secondary effects, right, and secondary impact. And that's something that's central on our minds here. Quick question. I think it's really important to better understand this variability and the uncertainty that you guys are modeling here, and that's something we always have to take into account with any kind of planning exercise. But I'm kind of curious, and I'll admit I'm not as close to a lot of the climate change literature as I probably should be. And we have models, and we can model uncertainty through various scenarios. And I may have missed this in your presentation, but the different scenarios you guys are looking at, are those IPCC scenarios or?
Yes, so I can go back to looking at the future.
Yeah.
So the CMIP5, so this is that coupled model in intercomparison project, is that right?
Right.
Ooh, got it.
Got
MTS
it.
is
Well
training me
done.
well. So CMIP6 is about to come out soon. But yeah, this is the IPCC kind of gold standard suite of models that we put together. And then, so that's 32 different models from different groups that could potentially be, as Imtiaz is teaching me, are treated equally as equal futures, equal probability of being what's happening in the future. And then the two emission scenarios. So the RCP 4.5 is if we get our act together in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and then 8.5 is more of the higher emission scenario. So looking at those 32 models, and then those same models under two emission scenarios. I don't know if Imtiaz wants to say anything about that, but.
No, thank you. That's helpful. And I guess my kind of like broader question, which may be unfair, given that we can measure the variability within the models based on how we parameterize these models. But I mean, is there information on like a degree of uncertainty or how confident we are in some of these kind of more these IPC scenarios, right? Given our understanding of global change dynamics, weather patterns, what different factors influence those and go into that. I mean, is there some kind of way to overlay that uncertainty onto the variability you see within your model outputs as well?
If Imtiaz has a lot of experience in scenario planning. So the way he pitched this to us was, you either use all of the models, or you do a subset of the models where you can dive into a specific that would have some marked response to whatever your response variable is. I don't know, Imtiaz, if you want to talk more about that, or kind of how these models are treated.
Yeah, thanks, Owen, and thanks for the question. On the uncertainty piece, yes, one of the uncertainties coming from using all these models and them giving this results across the board. So you can see in terms of precip, there are dry futures and there are very wet futures, and things in the middle. And so given that kind of variability and uncertainty, I think we can use the same word for both for these graphics here. One of the approaches has been working with different scenarios and seeing what kind of risk these different scenarios present, and what actions could help you to mitigate across much of that risk. So uncertainty is a real challenge because, again, you're looking at mid-century versus late century, that uncertainty actually increases. So these red and blue dots may actually, at least for the temperature, may actually really line up more close to each other if you look at mid-century, but by end of century, what does a 7 degree Celsius warming? That's a lot of warming. And, so I do see this kind of an interplay between precipitation and temperature, and the net results down there. And so I think working with scenarios give us, just a way to kind of work across these many models. I mean, and so just work more efficiently with our resources, but also kind of work with this pretty large uncertainty, which is really there. And then, of course, the other uncertainty is our models, especially the impacts models, are they the calibration that they had in the historic, is it still valid in the future? And so are we getting the right results? So should we be careful, as we use these impact models with this future information, that the results we are getting, is close to more accurate than not.
Yeah, and I'd add for this study, we really focused on these changes from, a 30-year climate period that we just experienced to the end of the 21st century to try to really get a bigger range of potential futures. And then we, connected that to a metric that we know that the management agencies use, which is May Ponds, to try to get this information that's as relevant as possible. Within that, this is sort of an opening shot from our group on a larger scale estimate. But from within that, I think, and now working on some of these other projects with NED and Region 3 Fish and Wildlife Service, now we're showing that we could now show mid-century changes, or really scope things to what's the time frame of decisions being made.
Great. Thank you so much. That's very helpful. Yes, this is fascinating work. Looking forward to tracking it.
Thank you.
Josh, for me, this is one of the kind of take homes that I originally, my original interaction with Owen is like, I think those of us who don't engage with climate literature all the time want to look for a mean and a distribution around the mean. What's the mean and what's the deviation from the mean, and how can we understand what the different scenarios are going to be, and then that notion of like all of these different models working in congruent and just demonstrating the variability is I think helpful, not only obviously from a modeling standpoint, but just like a way to wrap your head around future scenario planning and understanding. Is just like it's not the middle. We're not only planning for the middle scenario.
Yes, it's taken a lot of deprogramming for MTS to work with the ecologists and the folks that want to look at normal distributions around the mean.
Fun stuff. Yes, other questions, please?
Hi, I have a question. I'm Marta Lyons. I'm an ecologist with the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. And I was wondering whether you all have any plans to apply these tools and analyses to other wildlife species that are priorities for Fish and Wildlife Service, but maybe dependent on spatial and temporal aspects of prairie potholes that are different than those critical to waterfowl.
Thanks, Marta. This is a good question. I think that, again, as starting out on trying to figure out where we go with our mechanistic model of simulating wetland hydrology and adding it to be this more systems model of incorporating different biological aspects. The vision, if you ask Dave Mache, is certainly we'll be able to incorporate lots of responses. And if you look at our Cottonwood Lake study area data set, we have amphibians and we have all sorts of different biota that we've been tracking through time. This being one of the first efforts, I think low-hanging fruit was to use these hydrology responses to see, and relate things to these big data sets like 4 square mile survey and these large scale efforts with the waterfowl dollars and this relationship that Northern Prairie's had with HAPET for so long. But at the end of the day, we have a hydrology model that can output all sorts of things from climate inputs and wetland morphology inputs to give you hydro periods and water depths and things. And if we can relate that to biologically significant response variables, we could certainly incorporate things beyond waterfowl. Especially we're thinking about working with others at Northern Prairie, looking at shorebirds as well, and hopefully turtles.
I can't speak to this very well, but I know there's folks, and I'll mention Neil Nemeth again. And if Neil, you're on, you want to take over from here for a second, I totally understand. But there has been kind of a long-term plan to understand how to apply downscaled climate models to some of our geospatial data, and at the same time looking into developing some more robust models of other, species distribution. Neil's done a lot of work on grassland birds, which is kind of unrelated, but also wetland birds and shore birds that I think that once we get a hold of the climate piece, I think that there's some obvious connections between those existing models and different future climate, scenarios.
No, this is Neil, and Ned is exactly right. We had actually played with some data from the past, looking at the drought of the early 1990s to, then the mid 1990s, when things got a lot wetter, and populations of some of these species increased several fold. And we could expect the same thing in the future. Water really drives their populations, especially with the water birds, just as it does for waterfowl. And there'd be a lot of applications for other species.
Thanks, Neil.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of possibilities, and I know we're trying to look at different scales and different species of interest at Northern Prairie, and some work from Dave Mache and Kyle McLean. His dissertation work really is looking at these macroinvertebrate, aquatic invertebrate responses as well, and so that as a food source for the birds, but also as sort of an indicator on biodiversity, and looking at these shifts as we go directionally from this nice this nice variety of wetland sizes and hydro periods to more all wet all the time. What's the responses to the aquatic biota as well? And it's really interesting to see, as we lose some of that heterogeneity and variability, what types of responses could we see on all throughout the food chain.
Perhaps one last question or comment?
Yeah, this is Dennis Longknife calling again.
Go ahead, Dennis.
Yeah, I'm familiar with some of that last talk you gave on grassland birds. I'm currently working on a grassland restoration project through my climate change work, and been tracking the long-billed curlew here. Like I said, our wetlands have dried up already, but the curlew is here probably to nest and breed in the prairies, and probably moving on after the chicks are developed. But also in 2004, I did a reservation-wide amphibian inventory and assessment, and documented all the breeding sites. I went to 50 breeding sites and documented the species, amphibians and reptiles. It was pretty interesting because some of the ones we identified, we never knew we had here in Fort Belmont before. So now we got a species list, and also got a bird list of all the waterfowl that inhabit our wetlands. It's interesting to note that when I did this work, it was from 2000 to 2010. Now with climate change and everything's hotter and drier, a lot of these wetland sites that I used to monitor are dried up and no longer function the way they used to before. So if I get another grant and revisit some of these sites where I collected baseline data, things might change a lot. Any insights on that?
I would say, yeah, you could look to, we've done similar things at Northern Prairie. Being a center that's been around for over 50 years, it makes for good resampling efforts, especially once that the climate has shifted. And, to the drying out, we've done sort of the opposite of resampling regional ponds and doing more of these surveys. And looking at how things have changed when things got wetter. And so maybe there's some things in the literature there you could kind of use to guide what you're seeing there in more of the drying period, and understanding too the connections between local areas within the Prairie Pothole region. So when things really dried out here in the late 80s, early 90s, but it wasn't as dry in Minnesota. You know, I've heard people say there that was great times for the ducks there because they didn't have wet spots in the Dakotas. And so, you know, similarly, we're in this very large region, and certainly some of the takeaways that we have are focused more on the Dakotas.
Yeah, it's tough because ducks have wings so that they can. There's no water, they'll let you know real fast. But you know, like that, the notion of kind of repeating what you've done before and understanding, you know, having a good, you know, original design in place and then going back and on a, you know, on hopefully a time scale that makes sense for your programs to make sure that you're going back and repeating things is extremely useful. I mean, everything that we've built is because of the buy-in for a long-term survey at an appropriate interval to understand change. And so like any work that you can do where your interval to go back is appropriate to understand what might be going on and representing scenarios, I think sounds like a good idea to me.
Sorry, we're just run out of time actually. But thank you very much to our speakers today and all of you for participating in this great discussion. And so please take care and hope to see you next month on our webinar. Thanks again.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.